anytime you start modeling something, you want to look at reference. In case you don't know what a Ghostbuster trap is, you can just Google it and find some images. And we're going to use this just as a template, not really as an exact match that we're going to try to get, but just, there's a kind of box here that has different knobs and a handle on it and that kind of a thing. And that's kind of the general kind of direction we're going to try to model this object in, so we can start to learn some Maya. So I'm going to switch back to Maya, and anytime you start using Maya, you want to set your project. This is something to remember from here on out. This isn't just some thing that you want to do sometimes. This is, from day one when I was learning Maya till you work in a big studio, you want to set your project. Big studios have their own way of doing stuff, but a small studio maybe, you want to set your project. If you go to File, we'll go down to Set Project. And the reason this is important is because anytime you have, later down the road, you have textures, say you're doing a cloth simulation and you want to cache that out, or all these other technical things that we'll get into later, we need somewhere for Maya to save all those things to reference into the scene. So in my directory, I've made a Maya folder, and I'm going to set that. And it will ask you to create a default workspace. And typically this just means, it's going to save, kind of unimportant stuff like what kind of view did you have open? Was it a perspective or a side view? And, what kind of preferences maybe you had for that workspace. So you can just say create default workspace, and you won't have to do that again. You'll have to do that the first time you set a project. We're also going to go to the project window, the other option here under project. You can see project in gray. We only have two options. We've already done set project. The project is set. So let's go to project window, and we get all of these different folder options here. And if you don't see these names typed out here, you can go to edit, reset settings, and it should fill all of those out for you. And this will create folders, like I mentioned a moment ago, for caches, for images, and mostly we're going to be using for scenes, because when we save a Maya file, if we just hit Command S like you would in a Word document or whatever, just to save the file, it's going to save a .mb or a .ma. And that's M for Maya and A or B, depending on if you save an ASCII or a binary file. But that's not that important right now. Let's just hit accept, and it'll make all these folders. So when we go to File Save, let's go File Save Scene, and because we haven't done it yet, it'll open up this dialog box. And now we have this current project. It knows where our current project is, and we have all those folders that it had listed out. And anytime we're saving a scene, we want to save it in the scenes folder. And you can see that it is under our project that I defined as Maya. And now I can name it whatever I want, and I can choose to be an ASCII or a binary, and it doesn't really matter, to be honest, for our purposes. So I'm going to name that Ghostbuster Trap and hit save. So now we have the project saved, and that way if we need to move the project to another computer, it will have reference a path to the project settings, so it'll know where the textures are or anything else like that. So let's get started and model this Ghostbuster trap. So let's take a look at this reference, and we basically have a rectangle with a cylinder handle. So let's start with the most basic elements first, and then we'll add detail later. Because anytime you do modeling, whether it's hard or organic, let's start with the simplest shapes first and then add detail later. We don't want to start with the detail on really anything. And that goes, the same is true for animation. Most art, you start with the basics first. So let's create the rectangle and the handle, because those are the biggest, most obvious things. So in Maya, there's a couple different ways we can create things. We have this shelf here, the poly modeling shelf, and there are curves and surfaces here, which, it looks like they have similar things, but these are called NURB surfaces. And these aren't very useful for modeling and animation. They sometimes are used for kind of just to create controls on rigs, to create paths to revolve a shape around, or constrain a camera to a path, or fly a plane down a curve path, something like that. But for our purposes, we're not going to be using NURB surfaces. We're going to be doing poly modeling, where we have vertices, edges, and faces. So let's create the rectangle. We can click this rectangle right here and zoom in by right-clicking and holding down Alt and left-clicking to rotate around, if you remember. We could also create that by doing the polygon primitives, and we could pop this off if we wanted to and create a bunch of these cubes. That's another way to do it. But now that we have this, we can go over to our channel box here, and we can see we have a polycube 1. And we can see it's called pcube 1 here, and it's also called pcube 1 here, and it's highlighted, so we know this is what's highlighted. And I point out these things because, you know, we can translate this thing around different ways, and that's reflected here. But there's also other options. When we pop this down, we can get subdivisions. So if we wanted more subdivisions, we can go to subdivision width, height, and depth, and those will do different kind of dimensions on this, depending on if we need more geometry. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let's first make the basic shape. So I'll go to width, and I'll make this a little longer and a little wider and tall. So now we have something that approximates the size, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on the anti-aliasing and the ambient occlusion to help us visualize this. I'm also going to lift this up, and we can see, depending on the width, height, and depth, if I just change this to 5 and these to 2, then I know the height is 2, that this needs to go up 1 to be sitting right on the floor, right? Because it's measuring from the center. Wherever our manipulator is, that's where it's measuring from. So if it's a height of 2 and this is in the middle, then it's 1 to the floor, right? From where the manipulator is. If we bring this down to the floor, it's going to be at 0. So that's one way to kind of know how it's calculating what these numbers are exactly. So we have that rectangle. Now let's create the handle. We can click the cylinder here and drag this up. You can hit W if you don't have the manipulator selected yet. You can hit E to rotate this over. And to get it exact, we can just type in 90. You can do -90 or 90. For us, it doesn't really matter right now. And we could scale this down, or we could use, similarly, these types of attributes over here. So we could reduce the radius, or we could, just scale it down with the scale tool by hitting R. And let's move this to one side and move it up. And then we can make another cube a couple different ways. We could duplicate this one. We could hit Command D, and now we have another one that we can scale and do all these things to. But you can see when you duplicate, just with the shortcut, you don't have that option anymore, right? We don't have that polycube input that we had here. So sometimes it's nice to just use the basic tools to make sure that we have this history here that later we can go back in and change if we want to. So let's bring this here and scale it down a little bit. And let's talk about some ways to align things. So, if we wanted to get this to be exactly on this edge, it might be kind of hard to use the manipulator, back and forth. There are a couple different things we can do to move things around and be very specific. Of course, we can go up here and type in a number, but we could just be typing all day and, we might not get exactly visually what it looks like. So to know that we have snapped to that, we can use the snapping tools. But the snapping tools go based off of where the manipulator is. So, for example, if I hold down V on the keyboard, that means vertice. It's going to snap to vertice. And just to show you what the components that we're dealing with, to know what a vertice even is, let me break this down even further. So if we take this square, I'm just going to isolate it with this little button here, isolate select. I right click. Now I can see and change my selection mode to edge, vertex, vertex face, face, or back to object mode, which is what we're currently in. We're in object mode. That's also denoted by this little button up here in the top left. If we want to go to component mode, we can click this button. And again, it'll show that if you hold it down, or if you hover over it rather. And you can see the different kind of components that we can select here. And we can isolate those. So now we're selecting the lines. Or if we go back to this one and deselect the line, we get the vertice. So now we can edit the basic components of all the polygons here. And if we want to do this quickly, we can right click and hold, drag up and go to edge mode now. And now we can adjust the edges. So that just gives you a quick idea of what the components are that make up a polygon. So I just went to object mode to get back in so I can select the whole thing. I could also go up here and click this middle button to go back into object mode. I'm going to unisolate this now so we can go back to our model. So the next thing we need to understand is how to change where the manipulator is. So if I hold down V like I was describing earlier, and I middle mouse drag, if we click and hold on middle mouse, this is going to snap to vertices. You can see it's trying to snap to the corners of the box or the vertices of the cylinder. So, but we don't want the center to snap to it. We want the edge to snap to it. So we're going to need to change where this center pivot is. To do that, we can hold down D. And now we get a different type of manipulator here. And if we hold down V while we're holding down D, we can also snap the pivot to a vertice without the object moving, because we're just changing where the pivot is now. So if I let go of both, now we get the regular manipulator. If this doesn't come back, you can hit W to make sure that pops back to be the manipulator. So now when we move this, the whole thing moves around. Now what we can do is go and hold down V and middle mouse drag and isolate the up value. So we're only going to go up, and you can see it snapped upward. Now we can hold down the X axis and it will snap to the backside, which it seems like it has. So now we don't want this pivot here anymore. How do we get that back? That's not a big deal. We go to modify and we go down to center pivot. When we click this, now the pivot is back in the center, and we can move the pivot around later again if we want to, but now it's there. Also remember, you can see that the axis here is yellow. So if I was to start middle mouse dragging, it's going to be isolated on this no matter what I do or where I move my mouse, if it's middle mouse dragged. So, you just want to make sure that you understand how it's isolating these axes as you click them. That's one thing that, stumps a lot of people when they're just starting out, like, why can't I move this in a different axis? It's because we, selected that one and now it's thinking we want to isolate that. So this looks very basic right now, but I want to give you a quick introduction into how to create things, manipulate them, snap things around, choose a view and a piece of reference to try to add more detail in. So let's go back to our reference and look at a view like this. So I like to move my viewport to get a closer view of what the reference view is like. So it's kind of a 3/4 angle like this. Let's focus on this edge here, where there's a lower level here, and then it goes up, and there's a bevel, and there's a bevel here as well, and then it goes out. So we have this higher kind of rim and a lower area here. And it looks like the back area here is at the same level as this edge here. So let's just focus on that. Anytime you have reference in something that's kind of complicated, you're going to break it down into its components and simplify it and only work on little sections like that at a time. So let's do this kind of edge here. So I'm going to go back in, and if I go into my face mode, right clicking and going down to face, I select that and move it around. I can't really move this and divide this in different sections. So I need edge loops here. And that's, if we go into edge mode, right clicking and dragging up, I can move individual edges. Well, we need more of those. We need an edge here to get that border. We need 2 edges here so that we can divide this section in half and it kind of have an angle between it. So let's add more edges. So to do that, we need to go to Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop. And what I like to do is to add tools that I'm going to use a lot to my custom shelf. So let's move over to our custom shelf and go down to the Mesh Tools and hold down Command and Shift, and then click Insert Edge Loop and watch your custom shelf. Boom. We get a new tool here so that now we don't have to keep going back to this menu. And if you do this by accident in the future, or you just want to delete it, you can right click and go to delete. So let's click that. And if we click and drag this, we can kind of make these 2 kind of areas where we're going to have the lower section and the upper section, and we have this angle here. So we need to have two edge loops, one here and one there, so that we can make this division. It doesn't really matter where they are exactly. We can move that around later, but let's just get them in there now. So now we have those two edge loops, and the other thing that we're going to need to add are the edge loops of the border here. So let's go back to our insert edge loop tool. You can also, I'm going to hit Q to get off of it to just go to the select tool. And I'll go to object mode and select the object. You can see the last selected tool down here. So if I also hold down, well, I'm still selected on it. So let's go to the move tool. So now it's deselected. I can go back to the last one by selecting it here, or I can hit G is the shortcut to get back to that. So it'll do the same thing. So let's go to the move tool, and I'm going to hit G on the keyboard, and it'll go to the last used tool, which is the insert edge loop tool. So if we want to have this to be even on both sides, you can kind of try to eyeball it a little bit. And that might be, good for our purposes, but we're all about learning new stuff. So let's get more precise. Let's go to the tool settings here, which is next to this button. It'll pop up the tool settings panel, and depending on the tool that we have selected, it'll give us different options. If I change the tool here, you can see this menu will change every time I have a new tool. So with the insert edge loop tool selected, which I can get to there, or I can hit G. There's a bunch of different ways, which is kind of the theme of Maya. There's a lot of different ways to do the same thing. So it's just whatever you're more comfortable with or is quicker to work with for you. So now that we have this, let's go to the multiple edge loops option. And I've set it to 6, and let's go to 6. And if I click here and I drag, it won't matter because we're doing a equal distance from each other. So when I let go, you can see now we for sure have the same distance from the outside edge for these new edges that I made. But what if we don't want these interior edges? If I go to edge by right-clicking and dragging, and keep in mind, you do need to have your cursor over the object that you want to change to. If I was to do this up here and go to edge, it'll change to this object, and we don't want that. We want that object to stay in object mode. So let's click this and go to edge mode. And if I select this now, it's just going to select that one little section. But if I double click the edge, it'll select the whole edge loop if it goes all the way around. If it doesn't go all the way around, it won't select the whole thing. But okay, so if I hit delete now, because I don't want that, now you can see it still has a division here, right? There's got to be a vertice here. Look, there's a vertice there. We don't want that vertice. So I could go through and delete each of those vertices like this, but they're on all the corners, and it's kind of stupid to have to do that. So let's undo this and get that edge loop back. And I'll show you the right way to do it. So we'll go to edge loop. We will double click each edge and hold shift to select more than one edge. And now I'll hold down shift and right click and go to delete edge. And this is how you delete edges from now and forevermore. Okay, so use this because it'll get the vertices as well. So now this is one solid edge. It's not still divided up in a weird way. Cool. So the next problem we need to deal with is the fact that these kind of faces here should be at the same level, right? They should be down here somewhere. And not just those, but these here, right? Because we noticed in the reference, this kind of back area looks like it's at the same level. It goes across this. You can kind of see this little edge here, or, even this is a better view. Look at this kind of back edge. It's flat here, and then it looks like it lines up to this flat edge. So it's more like this is an extrusion than anything else. And, there's a bunch of different ways you could go about doing this. We could actually just select these two and extrude those up, which is probably the easiest thing to do. So let's go ahead and do that. Conversely, you could extrude everything else down, like I had selected earlier. And the other fun thing you can notice about Maya, as I'm undoing, it's reloading in the last selections. So it includes that in its undo history, which is kind of nice. So we could extrude these down, or we could just extrude these two sections up. Let's go this method because it's the less amount of things that we have to do, which is always good in 3D. So let's extrude these up. So to extrude, it's another tool like we did the insert edge loop tool, but this one is in the edit mesh. option here. And I'm going to Command Shift it because I'm going to use this more than once probably. And to that point, there's a ton of options in here to do stuff. And this is why I like adding things to my own custom shelf, because I'm not going to use most of this stuff, right? We're not even probably going to cover, half of this stuff because you just don't use it that much. So I like to create my own shelf of the tools I use the most, so I don't have to keep hunting through all these things up here. So I'm going to click the extrude tool, and I'm also going to turn off this kind of tool settings here so we get more view area space here. And so now we have this little window, and that gives us options for our extrusion. You can also see those options here in the inputs, kind of similarly when we were, changing the size of our original cube. We had that input down here, the polycube input, and it's still there, right? 5, 2, 2. Those are the things we changed in the previous lesson. And so it keeps all these inputs. When we added those split edges, what they call split ring, I don't know why they changed the type of language they're using. Instead of saying insert edge loop, for the tool, and now here they call it a split ring. So this is the history of what we've done on the object. You can see we added edges to this, and then we deleted some, and now we've extruded it. So it keeps the history of the object. There's also what we'll do at the end is delete all the history, so it's a lot cleaner when we're done with the model. So there's multiple ways to use this. We can just click and drag this. We could also, you can see it changes the local Z translate. We can also click and drag this. You can see it also changes here. We could also change the thickness, is pretty similar to the local Z translate, that is. Does kind of the same thing. And if you're having trouble clicking, and also, remember if you're doing something like this, you can click and drag on it here. You can also middle mouse drag it out here. And if it's going too fast, it's probably because of this little pie chart thing. And you can change the speed at which it moves. So this is the slowest one, and if I needed to go faster, I can click that a few times and it goes up. And we don't need it in this little window. It's actually also changing the one over here. You can see that if I change this one, or if I change that one, it'll update the other. So you can get it to it in two different places, and this is going to be super, super handy. Animating, modeling, this is a very useful tool to get more precise. So let's, make the thickness something like that. Now the problem we've encountered is we have this kind of stair step look instead of a kind of straight edge, the kind of diagonal that we're going for. If we look at the reference, let's get a better picture. Okay, now that we have a better picture, we can see that this is a slope. It's not a stair step. So how do we resolve that? Let's go about it and learn another new tool. So let's go to the face, and let's just delete these faces. And also be careful you're not selecting faces through it. This can be a common thing. You can see if I drag my mouse over here, I'm actually selecting things on the bottom side. And to double check that, you can also just go into wireframe mode. Let's hit 4 on our keyboard, and now we're in wireframe. So you can kind of see through the object and make sure you're not selecting something on the opposite side. So let's delete that. And let's go back into the shaded mode and hit 5. You can also get to these modes up here by toggling through them. This is a texture mode. We don't have texture, so that one doesn't matter. So now we have these holes that we need to fill. We'll go to Mesh Tools and go to Append to Polygon. And I'm going to Command Shift, add that to my custom shelf, select it, and now you can see there's kind of these highlighted borders. I don't know if that's super obvious in your view, but this is a thinner kind of green and this is a thicker green. So that's telling us where we can select. And if we hold our tool out in the viewport, or if we look down here in the bottom left, it'll say Append to Polygon tool, activate the object, then click on the first border edge to append on. So let's select one of these edges and then just select the other. And now we have this kind of bridge that we made. And let's hit enter and do the same for this other side. And remember, if we hit G, we can pull up the last use tool, and we can do the same thing and make a little bridge here. And let's hit G again and do the same for these holes. And you can see that we just have to do that for 2 edges, and it'll fill in the third edge. And let's hit G again. Whoops. I selected the wrong thing. So I just hit backspace and hit G again. Whoops. See, and it's trying to go to another, who knows why it's trying to go out there, but I didn't pick up I'm trying to hit that edge. So one thing I like to do is go to a view where there's kind of nothing behind this thing, right? So this is pretty much the only thing I can select if you're having trouble with it. And hit enter. And it looks like it didn't undo that goofy thing that it did. So I'm going to undo that, hit G, select the object, select the edge, and there we go. The other thing to keep in mind, let me just hit backspace to undo that. These purple things are arrows, so it's telling you the edge direction. So if I select an edge, you can see the arrows are pointing in a certain direction. They're going in this direction. They're huge, so it's kind of hard to see. But I think that's, if I chose this one, I might still do it. But if you have a problem where you have more than 2 or 3 edges, look at those purple arrows and see which direction it's going in if you're having trouble making that work. So now we have this type of slant to our object. How cool is that? And we have this back area is at the same level as those. So in this lesson, we learned the insert edge loop tool, the poly extrude tool, the append to polygon tool. We learned 3 new tools. We learned a lot, and those are tools you're going to use over and over again. So in the next lesson, we're going to continue to refine this. We're going to bevel some edges and keep adding more detail. Thanks for watching.